3 times, the world almost ended. Welcome to Your Dose of Wowness.
October 27, 1962. A Soviet submarine, cut off from Moscow for days, believes the war has already started. Depth charges are falling. 2 of the 3 officers required to authorize a nuclear launch have already said yes. History remembers the public brinkmanship between Kennedy and Khrushchev, but the absolute closest humanity came to nuclear war happened in silence, underwater, aboard a submarine the world wouldn't learn about for decades. This aerial reconnaissance photograph shows exactly what initiated the public standoff. American spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missile installations under construction in Cuba, sitting squarely within striking range of the United States. John F. Kennedy responded by instituting a strict naval quarantine, deploying American ships to physically block any further Soviet military material from reaching the island. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev met this with public defiance, triggering a diplomatic standoff that sent the globe into a panic over an imminent nuclear exchange. The public watched the diplomatic standoff between these 2 men because they appeared to be the only ones at the controls. But the actual outcome of the crisis had already slipped into the hands of a few Soviet naval officers operating entirely out of sight. The Soviet military had secretly dispatched a flotilla of 4 Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarines toward Cuba, each armed with a nuclear-tipped torpedo. One of these vessels, Submarine B-59, had been submerged to avoid detection for days. By late October, it had completely lost radio contact with Moscow, stranded in a total information vacuum. Without updated communications, the crew was operating on days-old intelligence from a period when international tensions were escalating rapidly. As civilians on land braced for an attack from the skies, the men who actually held the weapons were buried deep under the ocean, completely blind to the world above them. These submarines were designed for the freezing Arctic, not the warm tropical waters of the Caribbean. The mechanical systems aboard B-59 failed quickly under the heat, including the air conditioning. Interior temperatures spiked to physically debilitating levels. At the same time, the submarine's air scrubbers struggled to keep up, allowing dangerous amounts of carbon dioxide to accumulate in the confined compartments. Surviving accounts describe a crew stretched to their absolute physiological limits. They were severely dehydrated, exhausted from lack of sleep, and suffering from intense psychological strain. The officers aboard B-59 were trying to make rational decisions about a nuclear strike while trapped inside an overheating iron tube, their judgment eroded by the sheer physical trauma of their environment. On October 27, 1962, American destroyers enforcing the blockade successfully located B-59. Standing American naval protocol in this situation was to drop low-yield practice depth charges. These were small explosives intended purely as a warning, meant to force the submerged vessel to the surface so it could be identified. The depth charges weren't even meant as an attack. They were a signal to surface. Nobody had ever told the Soviets that. Inside the thin hull of B-59, isolated from any outside context, those concussions sounded like a sustained, lethal bombardment. Captain Valentin Savitsky assessed the stale intelligence, the terrifying heat, and the explosions rocking his ship, and reached a logical conclusion. World War III had already begun. He ordered the nuclear torpedo readied for launch. A standard naval knock on the door nearly ended civilization, because neither navy shared the same vocabulary for warning shots. This is the first of 4 Cold War near misses in this arc, and I promise you, they only get tenser from here. Subscribe if you want to catch every one of them, and tell me down in the comments if you'd heard of Arkhipov before this video, because I want to know how well known this story actually is. This diagram outlines standard Soviet naval doctrine for a nuclear strike on a Foxtrot-class submarine. It required unanimous agreement from exactly 2 men, the ship's captain and its political officer. But B-59 carried an administrative quirk. Because it was serving as the flagship for the entire flotilla, a localized rule required a 3rd overriding vote from the flotilla's chief of staff, Vasili Arkhipov. Captain Savitsky and political officer Ivan Maslenkinov both agreed to launch the torpedo against the American ships overhead. The decision came down to Arkhipov, and Arkhipov refused to consent. The world survived that day thanks to a random organizational accident. If any other submarine in that flotilla had been taking fire, or if the flagship hadn't required a third voter, the torpedo would have launched. Standing inside the sweltering control room, Arkhipov argued that the depth charges did not prove a war was happening above. He demanded they hold their fire and surface the ship to establish contact. His rank held the line. B-59 surfaced among the American destroyers. The immediate threat dissolved, and within days, the broader standoff over Cuba concluded with a negotiated withdrawal. The geopolitical chess match played by politicians in Washington and Moscow didn't stop a nuclear strike. The restraint of one exhausted man pushed to his physical limits did. Arkipov's role remained highly classified within Soviet naval records. He continued his military career and eventually passed away in 1998, largely uncelebrated for what happened in the Sargasso Sea. The world didn't find out how close this came for another 30 years. It wasn't until a 2002 conference in Havana that the historical community learned the true details of the near miss. History focuses on the visible actions of famous leaders, but human survival has often relied on the hidden, silent dissent of individuals acting in the dark, choosing human judgment over a system demanding war. One vote, cast by an exhausted man in an overheated submarine, may be the reason any of us are here. 21 years later, almost the exact same choice would fall to one man again, alone this time. No vote required, just his own judgment against a machine telling him missiles were already in the air. That's day 116, Stanislav Petrov.